Thank you very much. I'm delighted to be here. Uh, Perspective is, I've found, is probably the hardest thing to do to bring to events of the day, or particularly when we're confused about the events of yesterday. And so I want to talk today about three individuals who are Iowans, and particularly an art historian, but three individuals who were never elected to anything but played truly seminal roles in the history of this country, all in the same era, and all part of what we've kind of in a hackneyed way come to consider the greatest generation. But whether or not the term is hackneyed, it's probably correct. And especially if one thinks of what occurred in a particular era of human history. The first person I want to talk about is a social worker. And his name is Harry Hopkins, and he's a graduate of Grinnell. And after graduating from Grinnell, he went to New York City and was working in programs dealing with underprivileged people. And he met the Roosevelts. And he became the most trusted person in both Eleanor and Franklin Roosevelt's life. Indeed, he lived in the White House for 2.5 years, largely sleeping in the Lincoln bedroom. He is known almost entirely as the most important person during the New Deal pushing employment programs for the unemployed, particularly the New Deal. In fact, I had a grandfather on my mother's side who for $1 a year headed the WPA here in Iowa and was a great friend of Harry Hopkins. But his most important contribution to American history had nothing to do with the WPA or employment programs. Like all administrations, there are people you trust and you don't trust. And for whatever reason, Roosevelt was a little bit more of an untrusting type than some. And so he sent Harry Hopkins as an emissary of the United States government to Great Britain in the late 30s, partly because he didn't trust the United States ambassador to Great Britain. His name was Joseph B. Kennedy. And Kennedy was Irish and a founding member of the American First Movement, which was a little bit pro-German. And so the Brits considered him not the ideal choice to come to Great Britain because the Irish at the time had some discontent with British people and British history. In any regard, Winston Churchill was offended at such a low-ranking American being sent to visit Great Britain on what Roosevelt had told him was to be an assessment tour of how Britain was doing as the war was developing, and we were not part of it. Anyway, wherever Hopkins went, he made quite an impression, and in his last event, he quoted the Old Testament, and I forget the exact scripture, I apologize, but in effect it said that kith and kin stand together. And he then became known as Roosevelt's Man in Washington. He also, a year and a half later, was sent on a similar mission to the Soviet Union, where he met with Stalin. And Hopkins had had about half his stomach removed because of cancer and was in desperately poor health. He was flown in over Norway in the back of a military transport plane. And we arrived in Moscow, was virtually dead, and they had to give him many transfusions. And then he came out the same way and almost died again. But in both instances, Hopkins made the strongest possible recommendation. In the first instance, it was that we should pursue Lend-Lease, which was to get around the Neutrality Acts. And if you recall, at the time, Americans were quite isolationist. And how do you get around statutes that are passed that say you can't get involved in war? We did it through lending ships and other military equipment to the Brits, and then after we were engaged in the war, Hopkins was a great advocate of supporting the Soviet Union, which we did to the tune of some $20 billion of equipment, under the thesis that we had an alliance with the Russian people, even though we totally and completely had no sympathy for the Russian government. And even though we also knew we'd probably have a rivalry with the Soviet Union if the war ended on a happy note. In return for this $20 billion in equipment, 20 million Russians lost their lives. The greatest alliance in human history was the Russian-American-British alliance in World War II, and Harry Hopkins played a more seminal role than many people know. The second Iowan I want to note is a physicist, the Iowa-Cityan Jim Van Allen. Everybody knows that Jim was the greatest space explorer in history, but very few people know the seminal role he played in World War II. And I certainly had no knowledge of it till the celebration of his life ceremony at Hampshire a decade or so ago, in which they had 4 people speak from parts of his life, and the first was an elderly physicist from Johns Hopkins, who announced to the crowd that he wanted to tell about Jim Van Allen as an employee of and later a officer of the United States Navy. And everyone kind of wondered, what's this all about? And it ends up that Jim Van Allen in 1939 was a Carnegie Fellow working in Washington, D.C. And he is asked to join a top secret group that had been assembled by a group of scientists under the authority of an act of Congress to think through what it was that we might want to be prepared for if we were engaged in war. And this particular group became the founding basis for the Manhattan Project, which was the atomic bomb, and also upgrading radar and sonar. And then thirdly, doing work for the United States Navy. And Jim was tapped to work with the Navy. And the Navy had a problem, and that is with the long barrels of long guns on major ships like battleships and cruisers. Fully a third of the shells as they left the cannons went off in the air instead of when they were to strike a target. And so Jim was put in charge of trying to develop something called a proximity fuse, which he did. And in doing so, he had to experiment just like you do with fireworks. And so he rented 40 acres of farmland outside of Washington, D.C. in what's called Montgomery County, and then was told his work was top secret. He probably needed a gun because of presumed spies in the area. And so he's made a deputy sheriff of Montgomery County so he could carry a handgun. In any regard, the proximity fuse that he developed, he then patented, although it was a classified patent. And all it did was increase the firepower from about 67% effectiveness to 99%, which meant a 50% improvement in the firepower of the United States Navy. Then his group went further and developed what's called a radio proximity fuse for anti-aircraft, as well as for other kinds of uses. And everyone that's ever seen a World War II movie has seen the notion of ack-ack, and that's the pop, pop, pop of anti-aircraft fire. And ack-ack popping means they missed. Well, Jim's and his group's proximity fuse was about 600% more accurate than the ack-ack. And once they developed it, however, they had a stumbling block, and that was that the gunners, particularly in the Navy, loved ack-ack and refused to use his fuse. And so he accepted a commission in the United States Navy as a lieutenant commander in order to, in effect, commandeer a ship, which he did, and he went into the Pacific, and he went ship by ship to try to convince the captains to order the use of his shells. And the captains would say, you've got to talk to the gunners. And Jim was one of these unusual personalities, and I'm sure many of you in this room knew him, that you just instantly liked. And he was low key, and people just identified with him. But there was a demand that they do some testing, and in some of the testing, some of the shells failed. And so Jim took them apart and figured out that in the transportation over in the Pacific, in the wormholes of ships, that a number of the miniature batteries had failed. And so he ordered new batteries and put new batteries in the old shells and a new group of shells. And so he became the inventor and the repairman and the salesman for these upgraded shells. Now, the greatest naval engagement in the history of war is something called the Battle of Leyte Gulf. And in that battle, the Japanese used for the first time massive kamikaze attacks on the United States fleet. And Jim's shells knocked down virtually every kamikaze plane that came through. At the end of the war, and I go back to the Hampshire ceremony, the physicist from Johns Hopkins said, I want to read you a citation signed by the Secretary of Navy in 1946, and it read, is the first sentence, no individual is more responsible for the success of the United States Navy in World War II than Lieutenant Commander James Van Allen. That's a pretty impressive circumstance for an Iowa resident. Now, I might mention, in addition, the shells were transferred to the Brits, although the Brits had had some initial work on them before the Americans started. But Jim's shells knocked down virtually all of the B-1 buzz bombs that Germany sent, although they weren't fast enough to knock down some of the B-2. But the B-1, they almost completely manhandled. And then Ike didn't want to use the shells in land warfare because he was scared to death that the Germans would get a hold of the technology. But finally, in December of 1944, at the Battle of the Bulge, they were used, and what they were used for, and it sounds almost demonic, that instead of his first shells were used to hit ships instead of going off in the air. The second generation was used on the anti-aircraft to come within 70 feet of planes and then go off. And so to go off before striking. And then the shells in the Battle of the Bulge were used to go off 10 feet above the ground. And they found that this was vastly more devastating than shells that would burrow into the earth. And General Patton later wrote that he thought that these had changed all land warfare strategies. They were so devastating. Now, I just mentioned these men because of the extraordinary role they played. But the final Iowan, it has to be the most unlikely major participant in World War II, and this is the University of Iowa graduate from Winterset, George Stout, who was an art historian. Actually, more precisely, he was an art conservationist. And after graduating from the University of Iowa, he went on to get an advanced degree at Harvard, and he became the chief conservation specialist at the Fogg Museum at Harvard University. But he is possibly one of the first, or he became the seminal developer of all sorts of new chemical techniques in terms of use in the conservation of both painting and sculpture. But he also became not only a leader of a museum and in a field, he recommended to Washington that we establish in World War II a tactical concern for art objects and architectural objects. And at first, he came to be known as the lead monuments man, but the first effort was related to what we should be bombing and what we should not be bombing. And a commission was formed, largely at his instigation and several others, called the Roberts Commission, named for a Supreme Court justice who headed the commission on how to advise the United States government on what in effect is historic preservation in war. Then when World War II got underway in Europe from an American perspective, and that means after Omaha Beach and Utah Beach in the major landing, we came to know more than we knew before. And one of the things we learned of in very quick fashion was that the German government of Mr. Hitler and Mr. Goering was not only interested in what in effect was aggression, what in effect was mass killing, they were thieves. And the Holocaust stands as not only the greatest mass murder in history, but the greatest mass theft. And I, as an individual, came to man a kind of a half-century later outpost looking at this because as chairman of a committee of the United States Congress, I had read a newspaper article that at the end of World War II, the Swiss had not come completely clean on a role that they had played that we understood. They had been basically the financial intermediaries of the German government. And so Swiss banks had become complicitous in certain German activities. In the 30s, Swiss bank secrecy law had, and it had been relatively new, but it had come to be the perfect look-like protector for many Jewish families in Europe because if you think of the idea of pogroms, if you think that have gone on through history, and governmental confiscations and private confiscations of Jewish assets, the Swiss bankruptcy or Swiss secrecy laws seem to be perfect havens for savings of Jewish citizens throughout the continent. However, once the war had commenced and once the Holocaust had struck with the millions of lives lost, it became a law that facilitated confiscation of those that were killed, and killed without any family, if there were family, being able to produce a death certificate because they weren't issued at Auschwitz. And so the assets of many citizens were taken. And so as head of a committee dealing with banking, I decided to do a rather unusual thing for a Congress, and that is to look at historical rather than at contemporary events and do a review of the Holocaust as an asset theft circumstance. Now in that, after beginning with kind of an exploration of the Swiss role, there was an almost natural movement to other countries and other items. And so testifying before the committee came witnesses in the art history area, where the first, in the 90s, had become the first reviews of the Great Displacement of Art that had occurred throughout World War II. And with one seminal book by a lady named Lynn Nicholas entitled Rape of Europa, but coming to the conclusion that the greatest displacement of art in history was that which occurred in World War II, and that Hitler ended up with lists, Goering ended up with lists. Hitler always got first choice. Goering, it appears, always got second choice. Hitler had established a dream architecture of a museum to be built at the end of the war in his native part of, I think, more Austria than Germany, but part of each, I guess. And many of these items were taken and stored in salt caverns and other places throughout Germany and Austria, and perhaps some have not been found to this day. And it's become one of these great rumor mills that there might be more salt mines around. And certainly when we have all been reading in the last year and a half about the son of a German art dealer who collected quite a lot of art, it looks as if most of the art that he collected may be the legitimate property of his odd son. And I don't know if you followed the name Hildegard Gurlitt, the father, and the son. The father's sister, we've learned recently, was also an artist named Cornelia, and quite a good artist, who at about 25 committed suicide. But she was what is called an expressionist in an art field that is new to the 20th century. In any regard, these art circumstances, in one sense, are very small in proportion to the asset that occurred. When you think of 5 to 6 million people that lost their lives of the Jewish faith, then you think of their homes, you think of their businesses, you think of their pots, their pans, everything that goes in a home, their savings, which were all lost. And so art would only apply to a very few people. On the other hand, because art is such a significant phenomenon in terms of culture and obviously in terms of modern value, it's comes to have enormous symbolism. Now, under law, and one of the really interesting things that came to be focused upon is a difference in law. That is, as Americans kind of know, we are a common law country deriving our legal traditions from Great Britain. The continent is, largely speaking, what's called a Napoleonic code country, or system. And the Napoleonic codes are quite a credible system, just as the common law is quite a credible system. But they have different rules. And one of the rules that applies to theft is that if someone in this room sees someone wearing a watch that was stolen from them, they can demand that watch back, and under the law, get it back. And then the only recourse to the person wearing it is if he bought it from someone who might have been the thief. He has recourse, or she has recourse, to try to get compensation from the person who it's bought from. In the Napoleonic codes, if there's ever a good faith transfer, the transfer stands. So if someone is wearing a watch stolen from you that they bought from somebody else, that person keeps the watch, and the only recourse you have is to try to figure out who he bought it from, and then seek recourse from that intermediary. Now, why this matters is that when it comes to art that, let's say, is stolen from a Jewish home, in a common law country, if it was stolen by one person and then sold to another, that person that it was sold to owns that piece of art. In America, that art could be claimed legitimately by the person who holds it. But in Europe, it's a legitimate property of the person who bought it from an intermediary. Now, what we tried to do, and rather successfully, we used historical arguments, and a conference was held in Washington at the State Department in 1998 called the Washington Conference. And I chaired the session on Holocaust art. And we developed 11 principles that representatives of some 42 countries agreed to, and that was in public museums, they would agree to abide by common law rather than Napoleonic codes with art that might have been stolen in the Holocaust. Now, the trouble is, this is all voluntary, and so most museums have accepted these principles, and most museums have been willing to part with art, although not happily. If you're a museum director and you've got a great piece of art, and you feel a ownership, and you feel that the public you serve has a service, and so it's not a happy thing to have to give up art. But on the other hand, if one thinks about history and one thinks about why things happen the way they do, and is there a statute of limitation on such things as genocide? And here, a quite powerful moral case can be made that there should be no statute of limitation on genocide. But this has become a truly ongoing issue. Now, in Europe, if you're a private holder of such art, you don't have to give up anything. Actually, no museum has to give up things, but the museums have more or less come to the conclusion that for their own reputations, they should. But these are become then issues of what is called provenance. So provenance means who owned what when. And provenance research is often very difficult to do. It's often expensive, and it's often time-consuming, and it's sometimes, from a museum's perspective, an unhappy undertaking. But our museums have pretty much abided by the Washington principles that they're called, and a number of the major museums in Europe are also, but not everyone. I want to also mention that, and this is kind of a, quote, congressional thing. Everybody knows that in the last decade, the reputation of the Congress has suffered a bit. But for much of our history, the United States Congress is an emblem to the world. And so when we held hearings in the Congress, there was almost no attention in this country, but there was huge attention in Europe. And a number of European parliaments followed suit. And so I'm rather personally proud of that fact. But the end result of these hearings, and led by a rather impressive sub-cabinet official in the Clinton administration, a man named Stuart Eisenstadt, negotiations have been held with various countries around the world, and with through commissions that these hearings kind of pushed into creation, $6 to $8 billion of reparations, in effect, eventuated. And these art historical circumstances have come dramatically to the fore. And in coming to the fore, they put a sense of history on events in ways that were unsuspecting. One was that Hitler was an artist, largely unknown. And the tragedy is that a famous Viennese art school turned him down for admission. Otherwise, history might be different. And so universities ought to be careful about turning back people that look like they might be going in a wayward direction. But like all of us, I mean, every individual's entitled to be an art critic. And so some people in this room like modern art, some people like realist art, some people like impressionist art, expressionist, whatever it is. And we're all entitled to that, and no one is entitled to say my taste is better than your taste. Even though we might say that someone's trained in art and art history we might recognize as having good taste, but doesn't mean we necessarily like what they like. I mean, we are all individualists in this nature. Well, Hitler is of that mold, other than he was a dictator. And so we've come to learn that in Germany, he labeled certain art degenerate. Now, in this particular era, in the art world, much of the art that he termed degenerate is considered great art today. Now, in labeling things degenerate, it is true that he ordered the burning of some of this art. And by the way, it was disproportionately, degenerate artists were disproportionately Jewish. But not all. About half would have been Jewish, about half perhaps not. But that is the artist, Jewish. Now, because the Germans are German, they also recognize there is value to some of it. So symbolically, some was burned, but more than a little was sold. And in selling, they used art dealers, and that is why in the news in the last year has been this chap named Gerlit. His father was a dealer. And coming back to ownership, it looks like under German law that most of what he owns, he will be able to maintain. And it was sold from German museums. Some of what he owned is probably of a nature you'd call Holocaust stolen. And the son of Hildebrand Gerlit has indicated that he will give up that if people can prove their provenance. And so there will be some of that, but probably this man has $1 billion worth of art that's going to stand as his own. Although it may be that because of certain problems with government relating to taxes, etc., that it'll all end up in a public museum. We don't know. But not all of us will be taken from him. It's the assumption, at least in Germany today. Let me just mention, and I'm going to throw this open to question, but I want to mention an anecdote, and then it relates to George Stout and the Monuments Men in a very impressive way. There was a collecting center. Well, there were several collecting centers established in Germany when the Monuments Men would find salt caverns or find places where stolen art could be retrieved, and then they'd move it to these collecting centers. And one was in a town called Wiesbaden. And at Wiesbaden, there was a order given that some 202 pieces of German art should be sent to Washington. And the group at Wiesbaden, headed by their top person, a man named Captain Farmer, wrote something called the Wiesbaden Manifesto. And it actually was kind of insubordinate. And what they wrote to Washington was that they objected and that they were concerned. And it ends up that some of our museums had indicated that they'd like some of the art. And so when you looked at the movie, there was the famous actress, Kate Blanchett, was playing a female art historian from the Jeu de Paume, which is one of the really elite, wonderful art museums of the world in Paris. And she was not trusting George Clooney, of all people, who was playing our man George Stout. And what the movie didn't indicate was that she had some reason not to trust. And not that that George Stout was distrustful, but because she was deep in the art world, she knew that some American museums were making claims. And so she took a while to get the sense that maybe she could work with George Stout, which she fortunately finally did. And she had the lists of where some of the art was headed. And so it was a very helpful, that Kate was playing a lady named Rose Valland. And so this Rose Valland is one of the heroes of the Monuments Men effort, although she was not in the military. Anyway, at Wiesbaden, they wrote a manifesto, which became public. And if you think of yourself, if you're a military officer in war, you don't write manifestos telling your government how to run the war. But this is what it said, and I want to read it precisely how it began. We wish to state that from our knowledge, no historical grievance will rankle so long or be the cause of so much justified bitterness as the removal, for any reason, of a part of the heritage of any nation, even if that heritage may be interpreted as a prize of war. That's a very profound statement. And this is what makes George Stout and the Monuments Men the firers of the first salvo of the Cold War. Because, as the movie indicates, there was a race to find these treasures between the Soviet Army and the United States Army. And here the United States Army became pledged to return the stolen art. And the Soviets viewed this as booty of war. And so, in a way, this was this enormous expression of American values contrasted with Soviet values. And it was unbelievably appreciated. And who would have thought that a military hero was an art historian? I mean, that's extraordinarily wonderful. Anyway, I'm just going to end with another quote, if I can find it here. And maybe I didn't even bring it. Well, I have two quotes. I'm going to end with two quotes. One is it's a little presumptuous because it's a quote of mine. And at the in year 2000, I was invited by the Prime Minister of Israel to come and give a talk on the subject at an event in Tel Aviv. I concluded with this statement: mass murder makes concern for mass theft insignificant except for the motivational linkage. Because it is clear that avarice was one of the motivating factors of the hatred in man that precipitated the Holocaust, it is imperative that we continue to focus the lens of moral accountability beyond the SS troops' mass graves, gas chambers, and furnaces that previously dominated historical scrutiny into the gray, shadowy corners of the Holocaust where greed reigned. The factories, warehouses, boardrooms, bank lobbies, salons, museums, and professional offices of Axis nations, neutral countries, occupied land, and even the Allied powers that eventually prevailed over the Wehrmacht. And what have we learned? In the stories of the victims and their persecutors, we have unearthed an axiom about the nature of evil. The genesis of evil may begin with perpetrators of violence and injustice, but complicity too frequently lies beyond the perpetrators and those who cloak themselves in the legitimacy of private business and genteel society while manipulating manifestly oppressive circumstances in furtherance of self-interest, oblivious to hate-driven crimes, even genocide. This lesson remains profoundly relevant for the ages. And I mention this because commissions were established, one headed by Paul Volcker to look at worldwide banking issues, one headed by a man named Bergier looking at certain Swiss circumstances, one by a former Secretary of State named Larry Eagleburger looking at the role of German and Italian insurance companies. And the complicity of these many institutions were rather extraordinary. So I want to end with one other quote, and this is of George Stout. And George wrote an essay entitled "This I Believe." In fact, it's a "This I Believe" essay. That's the title of it. And this is what he said. "I have to admit that man's growth toward civilization looks slow and unsteady. At moments, whole nations seem to fall back. Their people fret for deliverance from selfish fears. They pay homage to persons who have snatched power for themselves, all manner of tyrants, and people beg them for comfort and for peace. But when I look beyond the weak spots, I can notice those men who pursue knowledge for the common benefit, or labor for sound structures rather than for gain, or fight and die, not for praise or possession, but for the freedom of others. These are not strange or distant to men." He's describing himself. And that's a pretty profound lesson for man, too. Thank you very much. Yeah.
So we're going to have a brief question and answer session. So if you have a question, just raise your hand. I'll come over with the microphone.
Well, in some circumstances, it's easy. You have a bill of sale. And so if you've bought something, David, from let's say a art gallery, and you have the bill of sale, and let's say you give it to the University of Iowa Museum, you give them the bill of sale, and you have the provenance. In other cases, it is unbelievably complicated. There are many things sold you have no idea. For example, many auctions, you don't know who provided the goods. And auction houses often have confidentiality assumptions. And so it can be very difficult to trace. I suspect if one thinks of the things in one's own house, whether they be art or objects of any nature, over time one forgets where one got one, and certainly one doesn't normally keep bills of sale. And so there are a lot of things that become quite difficult. And then you have the issue, provenance often legitimizes the art by the artist. And so you have a lot of fake art out there. And provenance is one way to help ascertain what's real and unreal. It's only one way, because you also look at the quality, and you have art historians that give judgments and that sort of thing. One of the things that becomes a little bit self-apparent for people that deal in these areas is when things get to be very valuable, it's not always that you have the best instincts and truth. And so you can have seemingly highly reputable people that might make claims that may not be exactly right. So you get a lot of difficulties in this. Now, on the Holocaust issue, there have been a number of lawsuits. So, among other things, how do you determine who is a rightful heir? Especially if suddenly you're going to distant cousins and for survivors. And then how do you know where something existed at a point in time? And so it becomes an extraordinary burden of proof on people that may be quite legitimate, and then it might be mischievous for someone that's illegitimate. But these are really hard things to work through. And in the Holocaust circumstance, you might not know how many cousins there might be. And how do you prove that your family held something? Now, some of the major holdings end up being by people that were major collectors at one point in time, or were art dealers at a particular time. But it is really very difficult for these things to work through. Well, in case you didn't hear this, this gentleman's telling a British Secret Service anecdote about dislike for Joe Kennedy in Britain. But he also is asked how many things found a home. Not everything did. In fact, some of the things that went to the son of Hildebrand Gerlot came from the Monuments Men. And there is a belief that they were too quick to give him some things, and they might be taken back in another way, not by us, but by others. I think it's probable that most artworks have found a home. Whether it's exact home, it's hard to know. I mean, our government started out with the premise we want them returned to the country of origin. And then to a disproportionate extent, sometimes the country played a role in trying to figure these things out. The things that were owed to museums, I think, have done pretty well. Now, one of the things the Russians have done, they, for years and years, refused to inventory anything. And they had clever reason to refuse to inventory. If you were the local party boss of a town, you might demand a piece of art, and you don't want it on an inventory list. If you're a museum director, you might not be perfectly honest, and some of this might have just gotten into international art markets. Some might be held in private places in Russia. But we're still looking for major works of art, particularly by 1920s and 30s artists, that we have no idea if they exist or don't exist. There was once an assumption that virtually all of it was burned, and now it looks like some of it was burned. Now, in terms of what the Monuments Men controlled, they were pretty short-handed, and I'm sure they made a mistake or two, and there's been a little criticism of that. But on the whole, they did a 100% good-hearted effort, and then possibly not quite that high a percent has gone exactly to where things should belong. We just had a newspaper article a week or so ago about the Viennese symphony that had an artwork that they sent back to France to an individual. And some view this as triumphant, others are saying it was pretty slow of them to do that. But I don't know how you grade it. I mean, it'd be an impossible task because you don't know what mistakes you've made. Mm-hmm. Well, it's a good question. I don't know if Congress has looked at it very carefully, but you're right that this isn't the only genocide. Many genocides that have existed, though, have not had the wealth associated with it as much. Now, George Stout in 1945 switched directions and was sent to Japan at the end of the war. The war was over. And I'm not sure, there's no particular record that I've seen of what he did there, but it was to make sure that art wasn't confiscated. But you're right, there are many other awful places in history, and some of the results have been imperfect. We, forgetting genocide, when we entered Iraq, a fellow congressman and I wrote a letter to the Department of Defense for which we never got a response, saying be careful of all the artifacts that you're going to be running into. And we know that some of those were taken by locals, basically. In Afghanistan, there's a rather wonderful tale about the gold objects. There's a term for them. I forget the term now. That the basically what we would call a conservator or a museum directors took home with them, but to save them from the Taliban. And they ended up turning them over to America, and we put them on a world tour. And the theory was that that way we could inventory everything and return it to Afghanistan, and it ended up being a much appreciated circumstance where I think we looked pretty good, but much better yet were a few Afghanis who viewed this as awfully critical to their heritage. And so they looked even better in a very difficult circumstance. Well, thank you all.
Jim, thank you so very much. Please do check the website for the next presentation that will be coming up. And Jim has agreed to answer some questions in the lobby too if you have additional questions. Thank you.